Based on the most recent data flowing from both the Persian Gulf and Washington, we are seeing a profound and perhaps historically unique divergence between global market behavior and geopolitical reality. As of Monday, May 11, 2026, the United States has reached the 10-week mark of active conflict with Iran, a duration that often transforms a crisis into a new normal for logistics and risk management. However, the events of the last 24 hours suggest that the path toward de-escalation has hit a significant roadblock. President Trump has officially rejected Iran's response to a US-led peace proposal, characterizing the terms as totally unacceptable. This development effectively resets the diplomatic clock and forces us to look closer at the kinetic reality on the ground, or more accurately, on the water. Currently, the Strait of Hormuz is defined by a series of competing blockades that have effectively turned one of the world's most critical maritime choke points into a high-stakes escort zone. The U.S. military is now actively guiding American-flagged vessels out of the Persian Gulf, a move that signals a lack of confidence in the immediate safety of unescorted commercial transit. Think of the Strait of Hormuz not merely as a waterway, but as the world's primary jugular vein for energy when that vein is constricted. The pressure doesn't just stay in the Middle East, it radiates through every gas pump and factory floor across the globe. This raises an important question for any observer of international trade. How long can the global supply chain sustain this level of direct military intervention before the costs of insurance and logistics begin to reshape the very definition of profitable trade? While the situation in the Gulf remains tense, the focus of the administration is simultaneously shifting toward Beijing. President Trump is scheduled to meet with President Xi Jinping for a summit that is expected to cover a massive range of friction points, including trade, technology, Taiwan, and notably, China's ongoing ties to Iran. However, the American delegation is entering these negotiations with a sudden and unexpected shift in their leverage. Just hours ago, a federal trade court ruled that President Trump's 10% global tariff plan is illegal. For an administration that has leaned heavily on universal tariffs as a primary tool for strategic positioning, this judicial intervention removes a significant piece from the board, right as the game moves into its most critical phase. This brings us to a curiosity gap in the current reporting. Why would a domestic trade court choose this specific moment to strike down a flagship policy? According to recent reporting, the ruling may hinge on the limits of executive authority over international commerce, but the timing creates a distinct disadvantage for the U.S. side in Beijing. When we analyze the incentives at play, we have to wonder if the Chinese delegation will see this as an opportunity to push back harder on technology restrictions, knowing that the threat of a 10% blanket tariff has been, at least temporarily, neutralized. Analysts suggest that this may indicate a period of increased volatility and trade negotiations, where the big stick of American policy is being shortened by its own legal system. Meanwhile, the American economic landscape presents a series of contradictions that would puzzle even the most seasoned analyst. Despite the 10-week conflict and the disruption in the Gulf, the stock market is currently maintaining a 6-week winning streak. This optimism, however, is facing a major stress test with the upcoming release of April's Consumer Price Index data. We are seeing a market that appears insulated from the kinetic reality of war. Yet we know that oil prices have already begun to climb following the breakdown of the ceasefire negotiations. This creates a pattern recognition insight. Markets often ignore geopolitical friction until the moment it translates into a hard data point, like a spike in inflation or a sudden drop in consumer spending. To mitigate the political fallout of rising energy costs, the administration is reportedly considering a pause on the federal gas tax, which currently sits at 18.4 cents per gallon. Energy Secretary Chris Wright has indicated that the administration is open to this move as a way to provide immediate relief at the pump. Think of it like this. If the conflict in the Gulf is a fire, a gas tax pause is a temporary cooling mist. It doesn't put out the fire, but it might make the heat more bearable for the average citizen for a short duration. But here is a key statistic to keep in mind. While 18.4 cents may seem significant to a household budget, it represents a massive reduction in the federal revenue used for infrastructure revenue that is difficult to replace once the pause is enacted. This economic balancing act is occurring just as the U.S. Senate prepares to confirm a new hand at the wheel of the Federal Reserve. Kevin Warsh is anticipated to succeed Jerome Powell as Fed chair, a transition that comes at a moment of extreme delicacy. The labor market is providing mixed signals. April's job growth exceeded expectations for the second month in a row, yet the overall rate of labor growth is actually slowing. This suggests we are in a phase of decelerating momentum. The car is still moving forward and even beating the speed limit, but the driver is slowly taking their foot off the gas. This raises a critical question for the incoming Fed leadership. How do you manage interest rates when the labor market is cooling but energy-driven inflation is potentially heating back up? According to multiple sources, the domestic legal and political environment is equally fluid. The U.S. Supreme Court has enacted a temporary halt on a mail ban for the abortion pill mifepristone, a move that maintains the status quo for now, but keeps a highly charged issue at the forefront of the national conversation. Simultaneously, the Virginia Supreme Court has ruled against Democratic redistricting efforts ahead of the midterms. These legal shifts aren't just about the specific cases, they represent the structural framework in which the next election will be fought. This doesn't necessarily mean a guaranteed outcome for either party, but it does suggest that the rules of the road for the upcoming midterms are still being litigated in real time. As we look back at the Iran situation, there is a significant intelligence gap that warrants our attention. We know that the president rejected the Iranian proposal as totally unacceptable, but the specific conditions of that proposal remain undisclosed. Based on recent foldings on the Commingers, we are seeing a profound disconnect was actually detached on regional sovereignty or the removal of sanctions that the administration views as non-negotiable. This lack of transparency creates an information vacuum that often leads to increased speculation. In a strategic pressure environment, what you don't say is often as important as what you do say. Does the rejection indicate a hardening of the U.S. position, or were the Iranian demands truly outside the realm of modern diplomacy? The pattern we are seeing here is one of strategic overlapping. The conflict in the Gulf is not an isolated event, it is inextricably linked to the trade talks in Beijing, the inflation data at home, and the leadership transition at the Federal Reserve. For instance, China is a major purchaser of Iranian oil. If the U.S. continues its escort operations and maintains its pressure on the Strait, it directly impacts China's energy security. This makes the Iran conflict a silent third party at the negotiating table in Beijing. How might China leverage its influence over Tehran to secure better trade terms from Washington? Or conversely, will the U.S. offer trade concessions in exchange for China helping to facilitate a more acceptable peace proposal from Iran? According to recent reporting, industry lobbyists are also placing pressure on the White House regarding AI vetting protocols. While the world's eyes are on the Gulf and Beijing, a regulatory vacuum is forming around the most transformative technology of the century. The administration has yet to formalize a policy, leaving companies to navigate an uncertain landscape of voluntary standards. This may indicate that the government is struggling to keep pace with the speed of technological development, or perhaps they are waiting to see what kind of tech sharing or tech restriction agreements might emerge from the meeting with President Xi. As we analyze these immediate implications, it becomes clear that we are witnessing a test of the American system's resilience on three fronts: the military's ability to secure trade routes, the judiciary's role in shaping economic policy, and the executive's capacity to manage a multi-theater diplomatic challenge. The rejection of the ceasefire and the court striking down of the tariff plan represent two significant adjustments to the administration's strategy in a single 24-hour period. This brings us to a key pattern. When a primary strategy like universal tariffs is removed, an administration is often forced to rely more heavily on kinetic or military levers to maintain global influence. This raises an important question. If the 10% global tariff is truly off the table, what is the new price for entry into the American market, and how will that be communicated to President Xi in the coming days? The stock market's 6-week winning streak suggests that investors are betting on a smooth resolution, or at least a manageable status quo. But with oil prices ticking upward and the CPI data looming, that insulation may be thinner than it appears. Think of the current market as a high-performance aircraft flying through a storm. The sensors are saying everything is fine, but the turbulence outside is undeniable. As we conclude this first look at the state of play on May 11, we are left with a series of open loops. We have a stalled peace process in the Middle East, a weakened trade hand in Asia, and a domestic economy that is showing both strength and signs of exhaustion. The next few days will likely determine if the 10-week conflict with Iran remains a localized disruption, or if it becomes the catalyst for a much broader shift in the global order. The real story isn't just that the peace proposal was rejected, it's the question of what happens next when the totally unacceptable becomes the only thing on the table. We'll be watching the Beijing summit closely to see if a new path emerges, or if the current patterns of pressure will only continue to tighten. If we look beyond the immediate headlines of the conflict in the Persian Gulf and the upcoming Beijing summit, we begin to see a deeper, more structural shift in how global power is being exercised and contested. We are moving out of an era of relatively predictable global trade and into what some analysts call an era of friction. where the domestic legal systems of superpowers are becoming as much of a battlefield as the actual trade routes. Think of it like this. For decades, the world operated on a set of unspoken rules that prioritize the flow of goods above all else. Now, those rules are being rewritten in real time by courtrooms in Virginia, trade tribunals in Washington, and naval commands in the Middle East. This raises an important question for any long-term observer of the global economy. What happens to a hyper-connected world when the connectivity itself becomes the primary target of political and legal maneuvering? According to recent reporting, the Federal Trade Court's ruling against the 10% global tariff plan is more than just a temporary setback for the administration. It represents a significant structural tension between executive ambition and judicial oversight. In the American system, the president's power to regulate commerce for national security reasons is broad, but it is not infinite. By striking down a blanket tariff, the court is essentially signaling that the U.S. cannot simply wall off its economy with a single executive order. This creates a fascinating curiosity gap. If the administration can no longer use broad-brush tariffs as its primary leverage, what replaces them? We may see a shift toward much more granular, sector-specific restrictions, surgical strikes on technology and capital, rather than a general levy on all goods. This doesn't necessarily mean a return to free trade, but it does suggest that the path toward economic decoupling will be far more complex and legally litigious than previously anticipated. While the lawyers argue in Washington, the reality on the water in the Strait of Hormuz is creating a different kind of structural change. The transition from open seas to a military escort model for American-flagged vessels is a profound shift in maritime policy. For nearly 80 years, the U.S. Navy has served as the ultimate guarantor of the global commons, ensuring that any ship could travel anywhere without fear of state-sponsored interference. Now we are seeing a club model of maritime security, where safety is no longer a universal right, but a specific service provided to allies and national interests. This raises a critical pattern recognition insight. Are we witnessing the end of the unified global shipping market? If insurance premiums and transit safety are now dependent on a ship's flag and its government's relationship with regional powers, the very cost of doing business is becoming balkanized. Think of it like a subscription service for global security. Those inside the escort umbrella can continue to trade, while those outside it face prohibitive risks. According to multiple sources, this convoy economy is already beginning to reshape energy markets. When we look at the 18.4 cents per gallon federal gas tax pause being considered, it's important to see it as more than just a political gesture for voters. It is an attempt to mask the rising security premium of oil. Based on current data, the actual cost of extracting and refining oil hasn't changed nearly as much as the cost of moving it through a contested choke point. The administration is essentially trying to use a domestic fiscal tool to offset a geopolitical logistics problem. But here is the catch. A gas tax pause is a finite resource. You can only pause a tax for so long before the infrastructure it funds begins to degrade, creating a classic trade-off between short-term consumer relief and long-term economic stability. This economic balancing act leads us directly to the doorstep of the Federal Reserve, where Kevin Warsh is expected to take the helm. The timing of this transition is historically unique. Typically, a new Fed chair wants a period of macroeconomic quiet to establish their credibility. Instead, Warsh is stepping into an environment defined by what analysts call imported volatility. If the conflict with Iran continues to drive oil prices higher and the Beijing summit fails to produce a breakthrough on trade, the Fed will be forced to choose between fighting energy-driven inflation and supporting a labor market that is already starting to cool. This raises an important question. Does a new Fed chair have the political capital to maintain high interest rates if the public is already feeling the pinch of conflict-driven energy costs? Recent reporting suggests that the stock market's 6-week winning streak is built on the assumption that these tensions are manageable. But there is a potential perception gap here. Financial markets often operate on a logic of discounting the future, assuming that a resolution is always just around the corner. However, geopolitical reality often operates on a logic of escalation dominance, where players are incentivized to increase pressure to prove their resolve. We are seeing a pattern where the market is pricing in a diplomatic win in Beijing, while the physical world is preparing for a long-term blockade in the Gulf. This divergence suggests that the upcoming Consumer Price Index, CPI data, will be more than just a number. It will be a reality check. If the CPI reflects the rising costs of the Hormuz blockade, that 6-week winning streak could face a very sudden adjustment. According to multiple sources, the role of China in this triangle is the ultimate wild card. For years, the narrative has been about a US-China trade war. But in May 2026, the situation has evolved into a strategic entanglement. China is the primary customer for the very Iranian oil that the U.S. is currently trying to manage in the Strait of Hormuz. This means that every move the U.S. military makes to escort ships or pressure Iran is also a move that affects China's industrial heartbeat. This creates a scenario-based thinking challenge. Will President Xi Jinping offer to calm the waters in the Gulf in exchange for the U.S. ignoring the recent court ruling and offering specific technology concessions? In this game, Iran isn't just a combatant. It is a point of leverage in a much larger conversation about the future of the 21st century economy. This brings us to the silent frontier of this conflict, the regulatory vacuum in artificial intelligence. While the world's attention is focused on tanks, ships, and oil barrels, industry lobbyists at the White House are working to define the rules for the technology that will drive the next century. There is a clear comparison to be made here with the early days of the internet. If the US adopts a light-touch regulatory environment to encourage innovation against China, it risks creating a domestic Wild West. But if it imposes strict vetting protocols, it may slow down the very tools it needs to maintain its edge. The lack of a formalized policy suggests that the administration is currently overwhelmed by the kinetic crises, allowing the digital future to be shaped by those with the most direct access to the halls of power. Think of it like this: we are trying to win a 21st century tech race while fighting a 20th century energy war, all while navigating an 18th century legal framework. The complexity is staggering. Based on available data, the Virginia Supreme Court's ruling on redistricting and the U.S. Supreme Court's decision on mifepristone indicate that the domestic political theater is just as fragmented as the international one. This internal division is a factor that foreign adversaries like Iran and China surely include in their strategic calculus. A superpower that is litigating its own borders and its own social norms is a superpower that may find it difficult to project a unified front in a 10-week or 10-month conflict. This raises an important question about the nature of modern resilience. Can a nation's economy remain insulated from its foreign policy indefinitely? The stock market's current optimism suggests a belief in geopolitical immunity, but history shows that this immunity eventually wears off when the costs are passed down to the consumer. According to recent reporting, the April job growth exceeded expectations, but the underlying labor growth is slowing. This is a classic late-cycle indicator. When you add the shock of an energy conflict and a trade summit at gunpoint, the margin for error becomes razor-thin. Analysts suggest that we may be looking at a pivot point where the U.S. has to decide which of its many priorities it values most: global maritime dominance, domestic price stability, or the preservation of its legal trade standards. Looking forward, the potential scenarios for the Beijing summit are wide-ranging. In one scenario, the US and China find a grand bargain that trades regional stability for market access, a return to a more transactional form of diplomacy. In another scenario, the failure of the ceasefire and the court ruling on tariffs lead to a hardening of positions where both nations retreat into economic fortresses, using their respective allies as buffers. The current data doesn't point to a guaranteed outcome, but it does highlight a clear pattern. The era of easy globalization is being replaced by an era of negotiated friction. Every gallon of gas, every microchip, and every maritime transit is now a subject of intense political negotiation. As we move deeper into May 2026, the unresolved loop isn't just about whether the ships can get through the Strait of Hormuz. It's about whether the global system itself can survive the transition from a world of rules to a world of leverage. The 10-week conflict with Iran has exposed the fragility of our energy supply chains, while the court ruling has exposed the limits of our trade policy. We are watching a high-stakes experiment in how a superpower manages a decline in its automatic influence and tries to replace it with active intervention. The Beijing summit will tell us if the world's two largest economies are ready to manage this friction together, or if we are headed for a much longer, more costly period of fragmentation. The resilience of the American system is being tested not just by its enemies abroad, but by the very complexity of the world it helped to create. One thing is certain: the new normal of 2026 will be defined by the realization that in a world of total connectivity, there is no such thing as a local conflict. Every ripple in the Persian Gulf eventually washes up on the shores of every economy on Earth.